Hello, my name is Michael Green and I welcome you to the 30th episode of my podcast, Historians in Conversation, which is hosted by the University of Lodz in Poland. My guest today is Professor Sabine Hiebsch from the Theological University of Utrecht. Sabine specializes in Lutheran religion and I welcome her to my podcast and I hope that you enjoy our conversation. Hello, Sabine. Welcome to my podcast. I'm glad that you found the time in your very busy schedule to talk to me. And I'm looking forward to your story and to hear about your motivation to research history, to be engaged with history. And I hope that our listeners will enjoy that conversation too.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you for accepting it. Well, I always start with the very same question. It's the question about the person's background. And I would like to ask you, where do you come from? And perhaps for our listeners, I will just point out that Sabine could be Dutch, but Hiebsch doesn't sound very Dutch. But you are professor at the Dutch University. So could you tell a little bit about your childhood?
Yeah.
And origins?
Exactly. Well, I'm not Dutch. I'm German, so it's a German name, and I was I grew up in Bad Nauheim. That is a small town of about 30,000 inhabitants north of Frankfurt.
Actually, know it.
Yeah, I guess a lot of people know it because Elvis Presley used to live there. So that is the first connotation for people. When he was in the army in Friedberg, he preferred Bad Nauheim to live there, which still is a competitive joke between the two cities to this day. So that is, I think, why some people know the name, but also it's a spa town. It has quite a famous spa. So, a lot of famous people from Sissi to Russian Tsars came there for their spa treatments. I'm an only child, and I grew up in a Catholic family. So I had a really very Catholic youth. I guess that is important, I think, for how my life developed and choices I made, I think. And I was born in 1964, and that was an era I remember really well, I think, influenced very much by how the country dealt with recent history, with the Nazi regime. Like in 1967, there was the publication of Alexander and Margarete Mitscherlik's book, Die Unfähigkeit zu trauern, the incapacity to mourn. But then again, some of my first childhood memories when I was maybe 10, 12 years old were from all the political activities of the Red Army fraction, the RAF, and what has come to be called the Deutsche Herbst, the German autumn, and everything that happened there. So when you asked me for the podcast, and I understood that I was going to talk as well about my childhood, I just remembered one of the things that every time I walked up to the train station to take the train to Frankfurt or to somewhere else, I really grew up with these posters with all the faces of the terrorists they were looking for. That is such a huge part of my childhood. So that also was, from the start, I think, in practice, seeing how people dealt with that recent German history from very, different perspectives. And I went to Catholic private school in Bad Nauheim that actually had been a girls' school, I think, until about 2 years before I started. So then we had the first boys. But it was a very funny contribution because there were like 22 girls and 3 boys, something like that, or 20 girls and 5 boys. So I was very much still in that transitional phase where it was actually quite normal to have almost only girls in the classroom. So that, and I always thought that Bad Nauheim actually was a very Catholic city, and only later I discovered that the Catholics actually were a minority. But the tradition was so strong in how I think it was lived at that school and everything around it, that to me, it was like, yeah, it's a Catholic town. And it definitely wasn't. So the Catholics maybe had like 25% of the inhabitants. But to me, I grew up feeling and thinking that, this huge world church, that was really the tradition there. It's kind of funny. I think I was already at university when I really realized the reality of that part of the history.
I think it's quite interesting because I've been to Bad Nauheim. I have a German professor, maybe you even know her, Heide Wunder, whom I visited several times in Bad Nauheim, and it seems a very peaceful and very beautiful town, and to be honest, it looked to me very Protestant. I didn't even know about the Catholic minority, so it's quite interesting that now you are bringing a different perspective on it.
Yeah.
And I think that there is something about that town that always evokes some sort of curiosity, and I wonder if besides the posters living in such a place, which had, well, maybe not very old history, but still some historical origin, somehow triggered your interest in the historical matter.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is a very interesting town because on the one hand, it's a small town, but on the other hand, it had a lot of cultural activities because it has the spa, the tourists or especially patients who came for that, and also because of the Jugendstil. So that's one of the very few cities that still has a whole park that is built in that style. And I think I also was lucky to have mostly good history teachers at school. Not all of them, but some of them. And that was also really very interesting to have this, to think that history is a fascinating topic and to know about that. And also remember with a lot of lessons, they tried at least to also, connect that to local history. So I think that was also really very interesting, for instance, with the Jewish community there and the synagogue, that was also connected within the lessons that we had at school and stuff like that. So, I didn't know back then that I was going to study theology and specialize in church history, but history as such was interesting to me, absolutely.
Well, it seems to me that this coexistence of different communities can trigger curiosity, but sometimes it goes into the negative direction, the negative curiosity. I think that it's also possible to have the positive one like you have and also like I did, or still do. As a child, what kind of books did you read? What was your favorite book?
I don't really recall one favorite book. I do remember when I think I was probably 12 years, something like that, was the first time I read Anne Frank's diary. And I remember that had a huge impact, but I guess that's also a generational thing that I was probably not the only one that thought that. And I was lucky at the gymnasium. We had a few teachers who really read interesting books with us, and specifically in French. We had a teacher who I thought was really fascinating because she had studied in cities like Prague, and that was really appealing. So someone that had seen other parts of the world. And at that time, there was still a blacklist, so a list with books that you were not supposed to read in school. And there was an interesting mixture, like for instance, Sartre was on that list and Simone de Beauvoir was on that list, but also children's books like Le Petit Nicolas. But that specific teacher, she didn't care about that. She just chose the books that she wanted to read with us. And apparently there was no protest from parents. So we read Sartre, we read de Beauvoir, we read Le Petit Nicolas, and all sorts of literature that was maybe not the common curriculum. And I think, I spent a lot of money at the local bookstore because it fascinated me. So I read more and more, and partly because of how that was dealt with at school.
What about the classical French historical novels of Dumas, or perhaps the English ones? Was it something that was available?
I did not read those directly during my school years. I did read Racine, Molière, and books like that. And for English,
very serious ones.
Yeah. I mean, partly. And also for English literature, we had a teacher who didn't just want to read the easier versions of literature, but she just thought we should be able to read the normal books. So we read Shakespeare, and all this. So that was fascinating in a way. And at the time, each week I had 2 or 3 children that I taught them French and English, and I remember that with that money, I very often bought books to the displeasure of my parents sometimes, who thought I should save some of the money. But it was fascinating. So we had a bunch of kids at school who liked to read as well. And so those were the times where I don't know, of course in Germany at that time, school ended at around 1:00. And so you had to do your homework, but then you had the whole afternoon to do other things. And I remember with friends, drinking tea and talking about stuff, but also knitting, crocheting, and still, talking about things. And books were a part of that. Not all of it, of course, but certainly a part of it. Yeah.
When you were studying at school, did you have any possibility to choose the direction which you wanted to pursue? For example, in my school, there were different types of education. You could go for the humanities, you could go for the more exact sciences or arts or technical education. Yeah. How was it at your school?
Yeah, we didn't have profiles, which I think in hindsight was really nice. So you didn't have to choose really between more natural sciences or math or language, etc. You just had to have a certain combination of, I think it was, when I remember correctly, 4 disciplines that you specialized in. So in the last 2.5 years, where we had most of the classes, but the combination was for a huge part up to the students, up to the pupils. And I think I was really happy. So my specialization was English, French, mathematics, and then the 4th was religion. That was a possibility. And the only topics I had to give up, because you couldn't do your examination in all the disciplines, I remember, was physics, and in the end chemistry. And I had all the other disciplines I still had, but they counted to a lesser degree into your exam at the end.
It sounds that the German school was rather stiff in comparison to what it is nowadays, because I think nowadays there is a lot more choice. But on the other hand, you had a lot of different skills that you actually obtained while being at school, such as languages.
Exactly, and I think that is probably one of the advantages of that system. And this school, the St. Liobas Schule, had and still has a really good reputation. So we had kids from the whole area, even from close to Frankfurt, who came to that school because it had such a good reputation. And I think rightly so. Yeah.
Then the time to finish school has approached, and you have done your final exams and passed them, obviously. So what was the choice? Where would you go? Did you have any options? Also, perhaps it's a place to ask you about the, maybe obvious and maybe less obvious thing, because I spoke to people who are 15 years younger than you, maybe even 20, and women. And women said that it was not obvious at all that they would go and study at the university level.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, how was it for you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because one of the podcasts you made that I listened to was with Mary Wiesnangs, because I know her well for a very long time. And I thought it was really interesting how she answered that question, that being born in 1952, it was not that obvious for her, or maybe go to college, but also not obvious to really have a professional career. And the strange thing is that even though I'm 12 years younger than she is, astonishingly, I think most of the girls at my school actually did not go to university. So for me, at a certain point, I was sure that I wanted to go to university. And my parents always supported that. So I never heard them say, why do you want to do that? Don't you think you're going to get married, etc. So I knew that for myself. I didn't have like a career planned out for the next 30 years, but I knew I wanted to study. But looking back, I know, looking at school reunions, etc., in the end, there only were really a few of the girls specifically who went to university. And I remember it was still the time that some of the girls already had a boyfriend for a couple of years. And I always had the impression that that kind of influenced the choices that they made, that it was also codependent on what this other person was doing. My problem was more that I didn't know exactly what I wanted to study. So I remember that my school had organized for us to visit several universities in Frankfurt, Gießen, Mainz. So there were like open days even back then. So we could visit the university. They had special classes with sorts of general information, but we could also just go sit in on several classes or seminars. And I discovered that I found a whole lot of disciplines interesting. So I went to social geography and I thought that was so interesting. Still think, by the way. And I did go to French classes. I looked at med school. I looked at law school. I found it really difficult. And I was thinking about Scandinavian languages, which is kind of funny given what I do now. But it meant at the time, one of the only places I could have done that was at the University of Bonn, which, strangely enough, I did end up studying later on. But at that time, I thought, I'm not sure if I want to go there. And also, in order to do Scandinavian languages, you had to do Icelandic. And that, to me, sounded scary. So I thought, do I really want to start with learning Icelandic? I wasn't sure. But I also discovered, once I came into the language seminars at Frankfurt and Mainz, that all the classes were actually in German. So they were discussing French, Italian, and Spanish books in German. And I was so disappointed because, I really spoke the languages, and I'd also started learning Spanish. And I thought, why would I study French literature in German? That sounded so counterintuitive. And many of the students had never been to the countries. They didn't really speak the language. So that was strange. And I couldn't really make up my mind. And in the end, I did register in Mainz for Romanic languages, but I wasn't really that convinced that I was going to do that. But then I spent that whole summer in Thésée at the ecumenical community in France. And that, being there that summer kind of changed my life, because I actually only went back to Germany to pack my suitcases and then went to live in Paris. And I started theology in Paris. So it was a totally different choice. So it was a busy summer. Let's call it that.
Weren't your parents afraid to let their little girl to go all the way alone to France? Given the fact that you were a private school girl and,
I think they were. But frankly, I was really convinced I was going to do that. And by the time I called them to tell them, I had found a place at the university there, and I had found a job to support myself. So, I had taken care of all of those things. And they never said that I shouldn't do that. I'm sure once I was older, specifically when I became a mother, I did understand better that it was probably a total shock for them, but they always supported me. And so for me, that was really the good decision to do that.
And then you went for theology. And you have not really mentioned your attitude towards religion and why theology. And then you're now thinking about your current position, you're professor of Lutheran theology. You just mentioned that you were growing up in a Catholic family, Catholic part of the town, and Catholic school. Could you maybe tell a little bit about that?
So at the time...
I mean, one doesn't contradict the other, of course.
Of course, no, but I mean, at the time, I was really still very Catholic. So I, like I mentioned, the fourth discipline I specialized in was religion. And I had come to, the first time I went to Thésée was in the, I have to say this correctly, in the fall of, I think, 82. And it was, I was fascinated. So I went together with, a girlfriend through one of the dioceses close by. We went on like this youth trip for a week to France, stayed at a beautiful convent built by Corbusier, and one of the day trips was to Thésée. And I was fascinated, and I couldn't by the time really tell you why, but the international sphere, the spirituality, the singing, I think also the tranquility of the landscape where Thésée is positioned. And so in the following spring, around Easter, I went back for 3 weeks on my own. And I was in contact with one of the brothers, one of the German brothers, and we talked a lot. And so once I was done with school, they invited me to stay the summer, not for a half year, but for the summer. And I also worked there. Once you're there for more than a week, they give you tasks to do, etc. So I worked there, and I really enjoyed just being in this international place and, I don't know, hearing and speaking all the languages. And so actually I met someone who became my boyfriend, and he lived in Paris. And so I had the possibility to visit Paris with him. And also, coincidentally, this year, Thésée's European meeting is held in Paris, and that was also the case in 1983. So that meant that a lot of people from Thésée already went to Paris in the early fall to prepare this meeting. And as I was fluent in French, and they asked if I could also, if I chose to stay in Paris, if I could help with some of the organization. So through this boyfriend, I found a room that I could rent for the year. And of course, there were some other people from Thésée that would be there occasionally. So that was kind of a first connection. And then I figured I was always interested in religion. And I knew of the Institut Catholique in Paris. And I went there to have a look and to see how things worked and what the possibilities were. And I didn't really think that, I was really maybe going to do the whole study, because I thought maybe I'd stay in Paris for a year. I didn't know whether I would go back to Germany or to somewhere else. But their theology program really appealed to me. So I went there to talk to them. And the funny thing is, like, you happen to know Bad Nauheim, so I went there and I asked someone a question in French, and without knowing it, that turned out to be the director of studies, who also knew that town. So we started to talk, and then he said, yeah, your French is good enough. You don't have to do any courses. If you want, you can register just for the courses that you want to do. And he was so nice and took the time to kind of walk me through the program. And of course, we're talking an analog time, so you didn't have a computer to check that on. And so that was really a great possibility. And through the Institut Catholique, not through their organization, but being in the building, I was kind of looking around, and of course, everything was new to me. So I had figured out that I could study there. And as I was standing in their courtyard, there was a man with a buggy and a child and another child in a stroller. And he was kind of looking they had an office where you could ask for people who were looking for jobs. And he was looking for someone for a babysitter. And I said, actually, I'm looking for a job, and that is one of the things I could do. So we started talking, and his wife was there as well. And as it turned out, she was a professor at Wellesley College, and he was working with an international firm. And they were just in Paris also for 1 year. And we had this instant click. So, yeah, we kind of met again during that week. And I didn't want to be an au pair. I wanted my own room. I didn't want to work in the household, but I could imagine bringing children to kindergarten, picking them up, spending some time with them, that stuff. And we had this, really nice click, the parents and I, and also with the children. So within a week, they offered me, this position to have a few hours every day to, bring either one child or to the creche or to the Montessori kindergarten. And so I made enough money to pay my room and to pay my way. And I could combine that with the hours at the university, because her being a university professor, she found it, for her, it was really important that I could do the courses I wanted. So we kind of made this schedule, and I could combine those things. So that's how I started there.
It seems like the stars fell on the right spot, or it was the providence that guided you. Depends on the point of view, but I think it's really amazing how everything fell in place.
Yeah,
because
it was
usually people struggle either with rooms or jobs or parents. So I really think that in your case, it went all very well. And when did you decide on specialization? Was it already during I think back then it was still the combined degree, bachelor's and master's, right?
Well, I had to, so I chose certain courses. I had to do Greek because I hadn't done Greek at my school. I had done Latin, but not Greek. So I did that. And I chose a few courses that interested me. So this was the period where you still had a lot of influence from the Nouvelle Theologie at the Institut. So that was one of the strongholds there. And also there was also a stronghold was the philosophy of Levinas. That was also quite strong in that period. But you also had people like Claude Jenner on Old Testament. And so I kind of made a combination of things that were fitting for that year. Without knowing, of course, at the beginning that, or whether I would really continue theology, whether I would stay there for a longer period. But I think I had not the full course load because I was working as well, and I was helping prepare this Thésée meeting. But I did quite a lot, so it was rather a full schedule. Yeah.
And then you finished the degree, and probably was time to decide what's next. And then the question is, did you actually plan for a PhD already? Was it something that you were aspiring to, or it was just accidental? Because those things also happen, that someone proposes a position and then it's a secure job for 4 years and people just go for it.
No, in that first year of studies, I had not planned for that. But what I did know at the end of that year, that I wanted to continue theology. That was obvious, and we're still talking Catholic theology. So I'm still very Catholic. So I was part of the international Catholic student community and stuff like that. But then it was rather, difficult to decide where to go to in Germany. So I kind of went, I had few possibilities for Catholic theology, but in the end I chose to go to Tübingen. So I moved to Tübingen in the fall of 1984.
So you left France?
Yeah, I left France and I moved to Tübingen. And I still, I was registered for Catholic theology, but I decided early on that I wanted to do Hebrew at the Protestant faculty, because that was, of course, that went much deeper. And so I was one of the people who survived, Hebrew classes with Herr Neef, which was not an automatic, how do you say that, success? I think that was probably one of the hardest times work-wise to have this Hebrew class every day and then go home and at least work for 4 other hours and study the Hebrew and do the stuff. So that was the first connection that I did study Catholic theology, but the language at least I wanted to do with the Protestants. But I think what probably had a lot of influence on me as well was that this was, of course, the time that Hans Küng was in Tübingen and had the Ecumenical Institute together with Karl Josef Kosche. So I also did a few things there. And I remember being really astonished that if you did a course with them and you had your paper, they didn't just count that automatically. They actually counted it as though you had done it in a foreign country. So that was a bit the status quo of the ecumenical reality. And I also did some classes at the Institutum Judaicum, which I think was a really good institute in Tübingen. So that meant, and I don't know if I was aware of that really at the time, but looking back, I realized that from that point on, I kind of looked much broader at theology than just the Catholic theology. And of course, through the Hebrew classes, I got to know a lot of Protestant theology students. And that also changed your perspective. On the other hand, I was very often at the Carmel cloister in the monastery in Tübingen they had at the time. It's not there anymore, unfortunately. And that, of course, was also like a Catholic stronghold in a, of course, very Protestant city. But in Tübingen, I started to see that I did want to do research and that I got really interested in it. But it was also the time that I wanted to study more Protestant theology as well. So the next step was I tried to get a Fulbright for Boston College at first, together with a friend. And initially, we were selected, but they didn't count my year in Paris and her year somewhere else. So they thought pure on paper that we were rather young maybe to do that. So in the end, we didn't get the Fulbright. And so we decided to look at possibilities in the Netherlands. And we looked at Nijmegen at first, because of course, they had a very good Catholic faculty with Schillebeeks and Catharina Halkes. But yeah, once I had seen Amsterdam and the possibilities I would have here, we decided to choose Amsterdam. And that meant that I actually chose the University of Amsterdam, which of course had the various Protestant faculties. And I did also still do some stuff at the Catholic University, but that was the moment that also slowly I decided to leave the Catholic Church. So I became Protestant. I made the switch, and that also meant studying Protestant theology. So the last part of my study I did spend in Bonn in Germany, and that was also the period that I really kind of focused on church history and also focused on the period of the Reformation.
So how did you decide to go for the PhD?
So I had studied in Amsterdam. At first, normally you do this for a year, but I stayed a half year longer because I wanted to do more courses. And also I wanted to finish some of the courses with a paper. And Amsterdam at the period was quite famous for what is called the Amsterdamse School, the School of Amsterdam in theology, meaning, let's say, a heterogeneous direction within Dutch theology. So you had exegetes, biblical scholars, systematic theologians who focused really on the sources, kind of as a critique also on historical critical research. And that was fascinating to me anyway. But one of the professors who was inspired by that was Kooiman-Boendermaker, who was Luther scholar. And through him, I got to sit in on some of the Luther classes. And what was totally fascinating to me coming from Germany, we didn't really read source texts. We read the secondary literature. And before you dared put up your finger and say something about the source, of course, you had to have read all the secondary literature. You had to know what all the important authors said. But in Amsterdam, the approach was the other way around. You were reading a source and you were discussing a source, trying to understand what the text said and not caring about which famous person had said what about it. That was a second or third step. And for me, that was life-changing in how I did theology. So I did go back to Germany to finish my study there. I wanted to have the possibility to have the German exam, to be maybe able to either do research there or work in a congregation. But then I had the offer through Boendermaker to do a doctorate in Amsterdam, to have the possibility to choose that. And I did. And so after I finished my study in Bonn in 1991, I went back to the Netherlands in that same summer, and I have stayed since then.
It's now over 30 years that you're in the Netherlands.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Yeah.
Well, I think you are very international, and this is actually quite amazing to meet someone who has been to so many different environments, different academic environments, and I think that every environment is different and teaches you something new, some new approach and a new way of looking at things, and that's something that a lot of people who stay in one academic place don't really get. And there are a lot of people who continue to work their entire academic career in one place, the place where they did their bachelor's, master's, PhD. Well, maybe not postdoc, but just one place.
Yeah.
And then I want to ask you something that is not related very much to history itself or theology, but to career. Because one of the biggest challenges is this academic career. And I wanted to ask you if you had any strategy already when you reached the PhD level on how you were going to frame yourself into a future academic job, or it was something that you were not really aware of, and it was step by step.
I think it's a mixture in a way. What I discovered early on that mostly in my career, I was the first woman to do the things I did, which kind of seems strange because, I mean, one should think that things had already changed. But certainly in theology, church history, of course, is one of the more classic disciplines. And yeah, especially if you go back to the period of the Reformation, you don't find that many women. Even if you look at the Netherlands right now, there aren't even 3 women, who do Reformation history, church history at that level as professors. When I did the dissertation, I was actually the first female doctoral student of Boendermaker. That's one. So I was mostly the only woman in the research group we had. And what I discovered, and I know that a lot of my female colleagues can relate to this because that's one of the things we talk about at conferences, etc., that all these male colleagues of various levels, they were really nice until I finished my degree. Because all of a sudden I was competition because, of course, I wanted a job. And then all of a sudden everything changed. So that was kind of interesting to see. It's one of the moments that, you know, if I had been tempted to think that feminism wasn't needed anymore. So that was a wake-up call. And it's kind of interesting that varied from our colleagues saying, why do you need a paid job if you have a husband? Or colleagues saying, well, you just had a child. Don't you think, you know, you can go to the library once in a while? Why do you need a job? Yeah, that was kind of interesting. So, I mean, yeah, I had to deal with all that as well. And I mean, I had a strategy in the sense that maybe also because I had moved a lot and also during the PhD, I spent quite a lot of time in the States or in Great Britain. And I also knew for myself, I did not want to keep on moving like that. So I wanted to have this base here, spend time in other countries, I knew that I did not want to make the choice of traveling every week to a total different city or even a different country. So I wanted to work here. And I also, first when I became a Protestant was in the church in the Rhineland, which has both the Lutheran and the Reformed tradition. And in the Netherlands, I became a member of the Lutheran Church. And the Lutheran Church, specifically at that point when I got back, was of course then already one of the three partners in the process of bringing two Reformed churches and the Lutheran Church together in what would become the Protestant Church in the Netherlands in 2004. And that was also a process that was really interesting. And I was from 2001 a member of the Synod for almost 12 years, and I did some other work in commissions. So it was an academic engagement, but also an engagement through the synodal level and, being a member of a church and holding services and stuff like that. So I thought having these various perspectives certainly also was part of my strategy. So you have the academic interest, but also, let's call it the ecclesial reality. And although I started out as a Luther scholar, gradually I found it also very interesting to look at the history of Dutch Lutheranism. So once I worked at VU University, I more and more integrated these topics. And also because, frankly, there is almost no non-Dutch written research on that topic. I mean, there isn't even that much actual research. And I found through the international contacts I already had through Luther research that it was so interesting to have these comparisons with, for instance, Denmark or Sweden, Finland, Norway, and also I'm more and more interested in Poland. So, I mean, I think on the one hand, yes, there was a strategy, but on the other hand, the reality also was that it was quite difficult to navigate that because being part of a religious minority, not in the legal sense anymore, but let's say being part of the smallest group in the room, also meant that it's like the tradition that most of the students don't really get in touch with. Because in the former days at the University of Amsterdam, there was this double structure. You had your first part of the study that was general. It was a duplex ordo. And then only the last part was within the seminaries of the various churches. So that means that studying what still is a minority tradition, there are not as many places for that as though you're studying Reformed tradition in its various ways. And so that means there were not that many places where I could do that. And that kind of course, colored the strategy as well.
And eventually you became the special chair at the faculty of Kampen. How did that work out, if you could explain?
Yeah. So maybe it's
Kampen, maybe just one word I will mention for our listeners that Kampen is a very famous Protestant university in the Netherlands, which prepares, among others, also future ministers. Reformed ministers, I'm not sure about Lutheran ministers, if that's also part of the, no. So
no, it's connected to the Reformed churches that had separated from the big Reformed churches in 1944. So before that, I had a special research position as senior researcher at VU University. And when that ended after 6 years, the university in Kampen had shown interest in wanting to have me there and also offering the possibility of having a special chair. So this is an endowed chair that I have. And I thought it was, to me, really unexpected that this Reformed university was open to having a chair like that and to having one of the focus points on Luther as well. But I think it has a lot to do with the fact that being from, let's say, the smaller part of the big Reformed tradition, there was a connection, and also the Reformation period is an important part of the university's identity. So I think that was kind of the connection. So that started in 2017 in Kampen. But in the meantime, starting in 2022, the university has moved to Utrecht. So now it's called Theological University Utrecht. And on the one hand, it's still the university that trains the future pastors from that church, but it's much broader. So a third of our students actually comes from the large Protestant church in the Netherlands, and a third is from various smaller Protestant churches, which is kind of interesting. And of course, Utrecht is a large university city. So we're now in the position that a lot of students from other faculties, from other universities can find us. And what I have learned in these years that Luther, and specifically Dutch Lutheran history, and also specifically the material culture, I work a lot on religious heritage, is quite interesting for students. So that is, I'm very happy with that.
Thank you very much, Sabine, for this fascinating and very informative talk. I think that your story is really inspiring, and I hope that our listeners will be inspired by it too, especially those who consider where to go, what to study, but also our colleagues who may be struggling for one reason or another. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for your questions. It was very nice to talk to you.
Okay, so now it's stopped. That was very interesting.